welcome in everybody. Welcome to this virtual program that's being held within or by the Humanities Center here at the University of San Diego. This is a book discussion and reading of My Sister's Country by Alexis V. Jackson. I'll talk a little bit about and share some information on Alexis V. Jackson and also Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin, who will be in conversation with Alexis as well, and her work as we get started here. So a little bit about Alexis. Alexis V. Jackson is a Philadelphia-born, San Diego-based writer and teacher whose work has appeared in Poetry Magazine, Jubilat, The Amistad, La Libreta, Solstice Literary Magazine, and 805 Lit, among others. Jackson earned her MFA from Columbia University's School of the Arts and her Bachelor of Arts degree in English from Messiah Universities. She was also a 2021 finalist for the Poetry Foundation's Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Fellowship. Erica Hunt selected Jackson's debut collection, the focus of today, My Sister's Country, released January 2022, as a second place winner of the Court Press Institute's 2019 Poetry Prize. She has served as a reader for several publications, including Callaloo and Bond Magazine. Jackson has lectured here at the University of San Diego in the English department, and hopefully there are some folks in the room, students who may have had a chance to experience her in the classroom. It's great that she was able to be here with us for a season. She has also taught poetry at her alma mater, Messiah University. Now, Alexis will be in conversation with Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin from the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies and William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. She is also the author of several works in the aforementioned fields, including her latest, Read Until You Understand, The Profound Wisdom of Black Life in Literature. And it just so happens near me, not only do I have My Sister's Country here, but I also have Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin's text here with me as well, her most recent work. Yeah, so which is very exciting. So to have you both share in space and be in conversation together is going to be definitely powerful and telling for us all. So I'd love to hear from both of you and also hear from Alexis Jackson, who will be reading aspects of your work today. And again, for those in the audience who may not know, I'm Dr. Shannon Miller in the Department of History here at USD, and I'll be moderating or helping moderate this conversation today too. Great, so I'll open it up for Alexis to share your work.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you to everyone who is here this evening. I'm really excited to be sharing bits of my work and also be in conversation with Dr. Griffin, who is a longtime family friend, but also I had the privilege of being her research assistant when I was studying at Columbia University, and I grew immensely by just reviewing her work, honestly, and getting it ready for her. So I'm really excited about this opportunity. It feels full circle. So thank you to everyone who's here and to Dr. Griffin as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about the book, just a little bit, because I'm assuming not everyone has it, and then I'll go into begin the reading. And I've just to read a few pieces. I'm trying to keep a timer on to make sure I stay where I need to. So My Sister's Country is a book that I wrote most of the poems during my time at Columbia University, but began writing it right before, I would say, in 2017. The title comes from the understanding and idea that Black women in America, being considered countryless property at one point in our history, made country in one another. And so the text, the poems in this text are in conversation with that idea and pulling from that idea, largely pulling from the Black women's poetry canon, Black American women's poetry canon, but also heavily influenced by the Zuhitsu form, excuse me, which I studied under Cheryl Boyce Taylor when I learned that form, another amazing Black woman poet. And she talks about the benefit of the Zuhitsu form in that it is a Japanese form that doesn't have any one central point. The idea is that all these pieces are in conversation with one another. And I think that's very similar to the way that I was able to understand and conceive of an identity for myself in what feels like a world that doesn't necessarily have a clear understanding of what that correct version of an identity for Black women would be. I pulled a lot from Melissa Harris Perry's work as well. I was heavily influenced by that text where she talked about the crooked room theory. And mostly a summary of that is that a study was done, post-World War II studies were done, basically that showed that people could be placed in a room that was off-centered, crooked, and would disorient themselves often in order to fit that frame of reference. But a few actually were able to manage to set themselves upright and recognize that the room was crooked. And so again, with the idea of identity being countryless property, recreating and reimaging a truer version of myself and of Black women's identity, this text is concerned with setting myself upright, and in so doing, of course, all of the women inside of me and those who have influenced me. And so that's where this text is coming from. I said a lot, but I hope you all followed me. So I'm going to let the poems do the talking now. I'm going to start with the very first one. It's called Dear Mom, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after. Dear Mom, you wanted me when God didn't, told me to love him anyway, told me you had no business acting simple with that self-censoring pause man. But I was a blessing, mommy, a blessing, little girl. Your blessing, my blessing. And all of this just was like, it was wanting to be something else, but it couldn't because you said it. But somewhere between leaving your house and asking God about him and him and him and him and him, you wanted me. And God, he didn't. And I didn't know how to reckon that with my still being. Didn't know if that made you or God or God or God her or her. Maybe I wouldn't be so close to textbook anxious if you'd done what he, God, said. Maybe I wouldn't be so sad about the word depravity and about sin sickness existing and about people pushing past kids for trains if you done what God said. If you done what God said, maybe you'd be happier. Maybe you'd be more like Christ and less like all the heathens heathening without thinking about not heathening. Mommy, how do you look at your sin and love her? How do you teach her to be her and still need him who made you cry because of her, made you stop working with the church children because of her, made you think you're not worthy because of her? I really want your answer because you, him and her to me. And I need to know who to be someday. So if I want someone God doesn't, I can know how to answer like you, my blessing, my blessing, my blessing, my blessing, my blessing, and no. So this piece in particular, and it's hard because you all can't see it, but there's strike throughs, and I also have the words of Black women throughout the text are outlined because red was too expensive to print. But the idea of it being red was to also venerate the words of Black women, just as the words of Christ are venerated in the King James Version of the Protestant scriptures. And so here with the capitalization of him traditionally, as scholars of the Bible are taught, and myself going to all these Christian schools is taught that you have to capitalize him when referencing God. And so again, from the very beginning with this text, playing with and toying with the idea of who God is and, you know, God's gender, as well as the beginning of everything for me being my mother. So that's something you'll see if you have the text, but we'll start there. I'm going to now read My Sister's Country, which is of course the title poem. There. My Sister's Country. In the moments after his mania, I pick eggshell shrapnel out of my sister's eyes and ears and memories in my grandmother's kitchen. We hard boil hearts and double them, room temperature, bite-sized servings that put the meat back on our bellies, that keep us possible. We crack open the calabash and cleanse with proverbs and the fantastic about the women before the women before the women before us, who homed with the men before the men before the men before him. My mother compares her recipes to the myths. My grandmother ices our feet. My sisters count their scars. I watch. My mother leads them back to our home, to their rooms, to him, to a fresh dozen. I follow. I am wondering why we leave my grandmother's kitchen, why we leave holding each other to hold cold yolk and white, to sweep up the aborted chicken fetus cocoon pieces for atomic warhead him, why I leave watching for warring. We hear our mother try a different way of whisking. We hear him plead Black American man hypermasculinityenza for war crimes. My mother forgives without promise of reparations. My sisters build a country in me. I build a country in my grandmother's kitchen. Here, the women have callous feet and nimble fingers. Here, it is criminal for men to make breakfast. Here, Mars wears red nail polish and the scent of white diamonds, and I watch her watch me spoil. I'm going to try not to go too long in this. I'm going to go ahead and read Blue Brown as well. Blue Brown is a special poem to me because I wrote this poem during the second wave of Black Lives Matter. And I was really angry and I wanted something really angry to come out. Sorry, I muted myself. Expected something really angry to come out of the writing. And as so many poets have said before, Lucille Clifton talking about coming to poetry out of what you wonder, the poem does its own thing. So I thought it was going to be something that it turned out not to be. And what I ended up with was this really tender homage to the little Black girls who also experienced police brutality, the daughters of those who were murdered at the hands of police, and also what they have left and what their understanding of country then looks like. So I will read it for you. Blue Brown, for Renisha McBride, Corinne Gaines, Diamond, Indiana Reynolds, and then there's an ellipsis because we all know this list continues. My niece runs her hand across the top of my car. She calls it maybe black, says it might be navy, but she can't tell in the dark. She is 7. She grabs her tilted Afro puff and asks me what color it is. I say brown. She says I'm right, but some of the kids in her class think it's black. She says she tells them it's brown. She says her ballies are blue, true blue, she says, the blue you can see at nighttime. She snakes her fingers through mine at the crosswalk. She says the street is black. She says the outside of my throw-on slides are blue, a blue different from her sister's track bag, the blue that looks like someone's favorite color. She tells me that's her favorite color. She asks me for mine. I tell her black. She calls us black. She says we're not black like my car or the street or my favorite color or the mesh on the sides of her sister's track bag that lets the stuff inside breathe. We're the black that's really brown, like her mommy says her puff is, like the floor in her new house is, like my eyes, not navy brown, like some cars are really navy, but in the dark and in the day, everybody else can't tell sometimes. We use our free hands to make the shadow puppets jump in the porch light until my brother answers the door and she lets go. So of course, I mentioned it a little bit before, but also thinking of color theory, innocence, conceiving of and making sense of the world around you. And also at such a young age, knowing that you still have to correct people about your appearance, your identity. So I'm playing with all of that in this piece and exploring that through my my niece's eyes in a conversation I had with her. I'm going to read Cricket Room because it is a Zuhitsu and I should read a Zuhitsu. But I don't think I marked that page. Sorry, 1 second. I don't think it's 17. I can't read my handwriting, so I'm going to go look for that right now. Apologies. Okay, page 18. Here we go. So I do have a trigger warning for this piece for sexual violence. It's not the entire piece, but it is there, so trigger warning. And this is a Zuhitsu form that I mentioned before, so we're taking from fragments of things that other poets have written. So if you are familiar with, I don't know, Gwendolyn Brooks is here. You also have, I'm trying to think, Warsan Shida, another poet, also things that I've heard growing up. So you'll hear a few different lines and things here. I'll just read it and we'll start there. So Crooked Room. When I finally touch you, I won't ever remember holding my breath. These lengths of time like 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4, M-I, crooked letter I, trace crooked letters down the lining of your jaw. Blue in the face, river clay, your ear ends taste like salt and vinegar, and that's just fine. I still call you Candy, King, and Angel, and Baby Love. We still talk about Fish River Canyon like Namibia's up the street getting redone, like they'll let us in after the reno. And about the ice cream canyon crater and my butter pecan that we can't remember who spoon carved, playing spoons and the dozens with our legs laced together. Your mama's so ugly, Rice Krispies won't talk to her. Your mama's so dumb, she went to the dentist for a Bluetooth. Whose mama gave who what crooked big and second shovel licking toe? Shit. I'll burn the bacon and you haven't touched my eggs. And Gwendolyn Brooks wrote something about burnt breakfast and bleak ballads of dark villains and milk white maids. And you're already thinking of the Negro speaks of rivers and being born by the river. And I'm thinking of Vine's viral version, I was born by the river, I was shaking that ass. And it's been too hard living with nothing but the idea of you. I write these crooked poems with the idea of you when I'm worried about them having the wrong idea of you. So you'll never come home. And from the crooked system cell, you'll write crooked letters, crooked letter I, find all transit lines lead to the end of the road and everything can lead to 90s R&B or a musical score trapped in the yellow brick, trapped in the yellow wallpaper. Yellow or red boned is something I am not. Cooked marrow is closer to the true color of my skin. So you don't put me in songs or club sonnets. And that's just fine because I do. And I'm just fine until you reach for my waist and I'm wondering why you want what doesn't make you sing. Why you want lady in brown, dark phrases of womanhood, half notes scattered, crooked down across crooked room. Couldn't figure out whose hand was on my thigh, but it didn't matter. I must have wanted it. I was the one who missed the train, who made the dinner, who wore the red silk and the whole smile and the wax brows and the Nile and the Tigris and the Euphrates and Malaysian curly and the catfish and cheese grits thickness and dark red ribbons in my hair, milk tea on your fingers. The wood burns white all night. You pull in and out of me until I'm plump with love, round enough to eat. If I wasn't so damn fertile crescent, like I'd be able to stop growing them, to stop producing cash crop kids, more arid good land, to stop looking like good land, like Canaan, like second Eden, like the well and the drain. Delta Stewart is said to count while my gum pops to make this part easy. I think of her with you here and I start inhale counting, hunchback, hunchback. I saw a snake in my Bible between the beginnings. How strange to see it on legs with arms and feet, handing mother a clementine because it was jealous and just mean. I think I saw it in the Pledge of Allegiance and in the tent meeting, and strung between your hands when you laid them on Lily Blue and told her she'd be forgiven for dancing with Eddie Sherman when all she was doing was dancing with someone who wants to love her. So I know it's a really long piece and there's a lot mixed in there, but ultimately for me with this piece, what I'm doing is thinking about the ways that Black women conceive of love. There's an ideal, the conceit of the poem, of course, begins with an ideal lover, and then goes into the actual experiences of relationship with, in this poem in particular, Black men, and what that can look like, and what beauty it holds, and what dangers it holds as well. But how there's also always this desire, and at the end of the poem, of course, there's questions about whose fault any of this is, and what does it mean to want love. So it's complex and layered with all of these voices, and Tazaki Shange as well, right? On purpose. And also I really, really like pacing the poem with counting Mississippi, because that's something I learned how to do. And I think that it works really well to also give a nod to my roots as well, with my family coming from the deep South, all over the South really, but Mississippi is one of them. So I will stop here and let us begin the conversation. I was enough reading, I think. So thank you all for your time with that portion.
Well, thank you so much for that reading, for the readings that you selected for this beautiful, beautiful book. You know, as I was reading it and rereading it, I thought there's so much here, and this is a book that only Alexis Jackson could have written, and yet, you know, it's specific to who you are in the world, and it speaks to, you know, a country of Black women. It just does, and it speaks through the generations. But I also felt, you know, I felt that it speaks to your generation in particular in some ways. So I have some questions, but mostly they're just thoughts that are prompted. So there are no, you know, right or wrong answers, just wherever they take you. With that beautiful opening poem, Dear Mom, which you read, and I'm so glad you read it. I thought that I heard, not heard, but I was reminded of the way Shange ends For Colored Girls, right? Where she's like, I found God in myself and I loved her. And I just felt like, you know, if I were teaching Shange, I would also teach this poem, because they almost seem to be in beautiful conversation with each other. So can you talk a little bit more about Dear Mom and about why it's the opening of this collection? And as you said, as you were reading it, I was thinking, but they can't see what she's doing typographically.
Yeah.
Like I wanted to hold it up so, you know, so that they could just see what you were doing. And so can you talk a little bit about the poem, and then talk about the choices that you made, where you're crossing things out, and then we'll get to the outline, because the outline appears here first. But yeah, so just say some more about that.
Yeah, let me open it and look at it. No, so of course, the poem is definitely autobiographical. So this is a confessional piece. And I mentioned a little bit of it before, but I wanted to, why start with this poem? So of course, like I said, my mother being my first introduction to any form of God, a creator, she is the reference for me for even what the idea of a divine love could look like and does. And so I wanted to begin with that, but also absolutely a nod to finding God in yourself and what that looks like when you believe, for me, and it was a very real struggle, believing that there was something simple about my existence, you know, being the product of a relationship prior to my mother's marriage, and really feeling like there's something wrong with my existence, layered, of course, with being Black and woman, and being a darker skinned Black woman, and all of these things. So This poem is a nod to that struggle, but I really wanted to lean into, and I think Shenge, you're definitely right to bring her up. I think leaning into what happens in the conversation with country, right? And so my mother being Gaia to me, for lack of a better term. What does that conversation look like when you're trying to make sense of a God that was given to her? And she, of course, gave me that same God. But also understanding that parts of that that felt incongruent to myself and my experience, I could say no to. Like I had a right to say no to that. And the poem, I think, with Dear Mom, so I'm definitely pulling from Harmony Holiday as well, who has books to her father, and she starts with like Dear Dad. So I took that from her, but I thought having the conversation with country was important. And then typographically, what I'm doing is, of course, elevating my mother to that level of divine by having her words in red, but in crossing out little things like the capitalization, right? So if my mother is God, then anytime I speak to her, reference her, the Y for your should be capitalized. Her name, of course, is already capitalized, but my blessing, what she will call me, is also capitalized, right, with my every time. And then crossing out where there is God, crossing it out and replacing it with the he, right? So I think there's a deliberate choice to say, well, is God necessarily this a man, number one, and in this case situation not, but also to question that, like, why would it be he, and what does it mean to correct myself mid sentence, like mid conversation with her? So if this is true, then what I'm saying, I have to switch it and cross this out and capitalize this instead. And so it was an interesting poem to write and to edit, honestly, to revise, but those are all the things I was calling into question, as well as having a very real conversation, imagined, of course, with my mother here.
It's so, I mean, I want to move on. I could spend all of our time on this poem, because it has, I mean, I think that the beauty of giving yourself permission and giving others through writing this poem permission to question, and and that being able to question doesn't mean you come out on the other side not believing. Like you have more to believe in, right, on the other side. It's just extraordinary. And I thought of it, the singer Abby Lincoln, who's a poet in her own right, she was like, I inherited all these standard tunes that are part of the tradition, but I'm not singing them anymore. I'm going to write my own standard, right? I'm going to write my own because God gave me that gift. And that's what this felt like. Let's talk a little bit about the outline. So I didn't know when I read it, and you say there that Black women's words are in outline like Christ's words are in red in the New Testament. So I didn't know that you wanted them to be in red, and it was too expensive because I know, I just thought that's brilliant. Like, so it's inspired by that, but that the sacred words, the words that that you're giving us, you're giving us a sacred text in some ways that are made up of the words of Black women, poets, and ordinary Black women. And it's just so beautiful. So can you talk a little bit more about how you made that decision aesthetically and philosophically and theologically?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's so much, because this is like, I don't, Dr. Miller read, my biography, but there's a lot. So I went to a predominantly Black Christian elementary school, which from what I hear is quite rare. I didn't know, where we, studied scripture alongside like Langston Hughes, and I had to memorize Margaret Walker. Like I had to do all this stuff, and it just was like there were no questions about a God wanting our liberation. Like those things just kind of were. And so I think that combined with my father, also stepfather, being a preacher, and so being in church all the time, there's a lot there. Wait, let me go back. What's the question again? I want to make sure I'm answering.
Okay. Whatever you say is going to be interesting and good. I think it was a question of how you made the decision, the outline.
Yeah. Okay. I'm back.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. So I knew that when I was, and we'd spoken about it briefly, Dr. Griffin, a long time ago, but went to a Christian college as well because they gave me a scholarship. So I was there. But there were a lot of questions when I did get to my undergrad institution. I just happened to have such lovely study teachers in the English department who showed me Geneva Smitherman and June Jordan in their essay form, because I knew June Jordan's poetry, but not her essays. And so also being introduced to womanism, right? Things I had no idea existed. And I was just really, really angry. Honestly, I was really frustrated because I felt like for a very long time, there were things that didn't feel right that I was being taught about my body, and like me as a woman being, even as a girl, being like the thorn in someone's side and me needing to watch myself. And so a lot of that did not feel right. Also, we later joined a church that was accepting of women preaching, but that was not my experience growing up until I was in high school. So there's a lot about that just didn't feel right. I'll say. I think I even have a poem here that's a nod to Balaam's donkey on purpose, because a lot of Black women preachers reference that text when talking about, God could use the donkey, God could use me. But so all that to say, when I started writing this book, I knew that there were a lot of questions I had about wonderings. I had about a God who loved me and loved also loved June Jordan and also loved Ntozake Shange and also thought Beyonce was dope and also loved sex workers. What does that God look like? Because that's not the God I was given. And the God I had made me feel really, really bad about myself. And so the outline actually just kind of happened. I started doing it in workshops, and some of my peers called them the red letter gospels, which I thought was cool. That's not the title I went with because couldn't keep red letters, but the title on the cover is red. Yeah. So it was important to me that these words be elevated because, and my husband actually talks about it, shout out to him, Dr. Jamal Andrew Calloway, but the way that Black literature, and you talk about it as well, Dr. Griffin, is often at the center of Black theology. And because I was taught Black women's literature alongside scripture, I think that feeling, if you want to lean into it, the dream that why is her name Audre Lorde talks about in Poetry is Not a Luxury, right? That feeling was there. So it's well, how can Nikki Giovanni be, and we can read her in church and we can talk about her in church, but there's parts of her that we have to reject because this version of God we have says, no, or says it's sinful or says it's bad. And then also going to a predominantly white Christian high school, which I talk about in the Fresh Princess sonnets, then there's another layer of a white evangelical Christian God that I had not known existed, that then was saying there are other parts of me that weren't holy or pure or right, that didn't even recognize gospel music, really. That's a whole nother, layer. So I think, and also exotify spirituals, that's another conversation. So I think that for me, the entire time when I'm setting myself upright in this room, I'm absolutely pulling from things that my mother would have said or did say, things that Auntie said, and something that was important to me was leaning into another thing. I'm referencing you a lot, I'm sorry, but there was an interview that Dr. Griffin did where she spoke about the importance of recognizing, I'm saying I'm talking to you, that you spoke about with recognizing the importance and significance of if you're going to be a Black feminist, if you're going to be a womanist, right, that there are women who might not want to be and might not identify in that, but still being invested in their liberation. And those voices still absolutely were a part of me discovering and deciding who I was going to be and who I am. And there's nothing taken from them. And so I wanted all of those voices to be present and to get their due. Also pulling from, I'm sorry, I'm name dropping a lot, but pulling from Emner Bassey Phillip, right, where she gives us a fictive ancestor that co-writes this text with her. So for me, this is very similar. Like all of these women referenced here have co-written my understanding of myself into what feels holy and what feels pure and what feels right, and what makes me feel good about living. And they are definitely a Christ figure to me, if not a God figure as well. So that's where the outline comes from.
It's just, I mean, we could do a whole course.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's just so deep. And I'm like, and it's smart, smart, and beautiful. And so just a few more questions. I have so many, but one of them I think that the audience would really appreciate hearing. I'll bring them together in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
So the first part, I'll just do the first part. You, Alexis Jackson, when did you know you were a poet?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I like talking about this because I love my grandma, and so she's a part of it. I, like I said, went to this this elementary school where we were reciting and reading, and also being a part of, I think, Black Philly churches. It's what you do. Like, it's Black History Month. We're going to talk about Langston Hughes and we're going to do this stuff in church. So also, of course, I'd be remiss to not reference a lot of the musicality and the cadence in the book, of course, coming from the influence of Black preaching. So I can't say it doesn't. I need to mention that. But I think that when I was 12, I had a class with a teacher, Mr. Upshur, and we were reading we had this big textbook, and there was a lot of Langston Hughes in it. That was also the year that the collected Langston Hughes had come out. My mother bought that, and I was just like reading it all the time. And so heavily influenced by Harlem Renaissance and Black arts movement, because that's what I had. My mother, went to school in the 80s, and so she loved Black arts movement. And I had a lot of Langston Hughes. So all that to say, I had to write a poem, like we had to in class. And so I wrote mine, and people were hype about it. Honestly, like my at the time, my friend Rylan, he was really excited, and he showed the teacher. He's like, no, you gotta show somebody this. And the teacher was really excited and like read it to the class. And then I brought her home, and my grandma was really excited. And she made a copy of my notebook on the printer upstairs and framed it and put it on her wall. So I was like, okay, I guess I'm a poet. And I did leave that form for a while and did personal essay and, played with other things. Fiction, I've never been that great at, but other things. And I think for me, going back from my MFA and right before that, I just kind of, like, poetry does something that to me no other form can do. And I have so many questions, and I don't have straightforward answers. And poems just help me wonder clearly about those things. So I knew, I think when I was 12, kind of left it because I thought I had to make money, and poets didn't make money. And I came back to it in my young adulthood because it was the only thing I could use to write any of what I've written. Because like I said, I was an angry little somebody, and I needed to make sense of something, and poetry did that for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you've been called. I think poetry calls certain people.
Yeah.
And it's called you. And a lot of people hear a lot of Black preaching, and a lot of people read Langston Hughes, but they don't become poets.
This is
right? If that was true, like all of those other kids would be poets in that small Black Christian school. So the final question I'll ask you before I turn it over to Dr. Miller and then to the audience. This is a completely geeky question, and you don't have to go off on it. You can wait and say, okay, Farah, we're going to do this on our own.
Okay. I'm nervous.
About form. question about form, because you do so many fascinating things with form here. And then you've got a series of sonnets that I just really went back to and took my time reading. And then, the various forms that you use, the Japanese form that you talk about. So can you, does a poem find its form? Are you saying, oh, here's a form I want to play around with? Like, how does form come to you?
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm gonna try to get this like short version in, because there's so much there. So I'll give the true story of it in its order, I think, like really quickly. But like I said, this poetry just kind of lives rent free in me because I've, had it there. This is a lot. So some forms I learned honestly just like with the different professors I had and teachers. The late great Camilla Aisha Moon actually was the one who introduced me to Pantoum, and she's like, you should definitely play with Pantoum. And it broke open a poem I had for years, just sitting, like it just wasn't working, and the Pantoum brought it together. And it's a broken Pantoum form, which is here. But sometimes for me, it depends on, it can happen both ways. The form can just work. Like I could start writing and like, yeah, this needs to be in a ballad, or yes, this absolutely needs to be in sonnets. And other times I'll start writing something and it's not working. And I'm like, well, let's, in revision, how could this work? If we break it up, like what is happening here? The Fresh Princess sonnets are unique because I love them so much. They're actually a failed experiment. Because I wanted to do a sonnet crown and I just couldn't sustain it. I couldn't get them all written. But I wanted to, well, what I like about what the sonnet form affords me is that you can quickly enter and leave worlds so quickly. And I, pull the same line or words from the poem before it into the second one to join them and unite them. But the sonnet form works well there because I think it allowed me to give vignettes of what, for me, Fresh Princess existence in Philly was like, what a Black Philly girlhood looked like, all of its beauties and tragedies and violences. So that's that part of the form question. But I do think as well, when I was studying, and for nerdy me, you can't really study, Black women's poetry without starting with Wheatley, as I did, as I was taught to. But she begins her text with "Tu m'esinas," which is of course like a nod to this really important form. I'm just trying to paraphrase it because I know we don't have less time, but it's important. There's a way that Black writers traditionally have had to prove in some way, shape, or form, right, that we are worthy of this space, that our text should be taken seriously by pulling from form, by reimagining form, by breaking form. Like we can do other things, but we need to start first by acknowledging that we are learned in this way. So it was really important to me. I felt it necessary because I knew what I was doing. I knew that what I was doing was quote unquote experimental. And Kathy Park-Hong has a great essay on like why Black poets shouldn't be seen as experimental, because it's a long conversation, but basically a lot of Black poets started what we would call the avant-garde, right? And then for whatever reason, the field then decides to not recognize us and then call our work like marginalized in some way, shape, or form. But I knew that could happen. And I knew I ran the risk of that with what I was doing. So to do it in form was really important. So pull from Pantoum, to say that I was pulling from Zuhitsu, right? Thank God that I was introduced to that form, because I was writing these poems before I had it, but that actually felt right and made sense. So to say, yes, Kamiko Han does Zuhitsu and so do I. The long history that Black poets have of, playing with and breaking sonnet form as well. So the formal choices have found me, but also I chose to use them for those particular reasons.
Right.
And I think the new form, and I didn't know it was new. I thought it was a list poem I was doing, just being extra. But the playlist poem was one that just made sense to me. And I think that's kind of what you were talking about, Dr. Griffin, when you said like my generation, because this is a very millennial, like Black woman's book. I've been made aware of that recently. Yeah, we're talking about Missy Elliott, and also I didn't realize how, so I'm happy that I know Black women felt connected to this when I did a reading recently, but I didn't realize how many Black women of faith had the same questions and the same struggles in trying to make sense of, you know, this violence that we experience, but also believing firmly and truly that there is a divine creator that loves us wholly and deeply as we are. So yeah, that was a long answer.
Answer. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Miller. Like we could talk about Philly girlhood. We could talk about. I had questions about egg imagery.
Yeah,
like there's eggs everywhere. But
they are everywhere.
Everything, eggs in every way you can imagine. I'll turn it back to Dr. Miller, and thank you for giving me this time to engage you about your beautiful work.
Yes, no, thank you. And just FYI, in case y'all didn't know, Dr. Griffin's also from Philly, so 215 all day.
Like multi-generational Philly girls. Right?
Just gotta put that out there. 215. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And I want to open the floor in the time that we have remaining. If anybody in the room had questions or responses to this dynamic conversation that we heard, and if you do, you can drop it in the chat or raise your hand. There were so many points that were made between you both in this conversation, questions that I had too. And while we wait and just see if folks in the room have questions, there are a couple that I have time to posit and share and have for the both of you. And one of the questions that came up for me, and a lot of these, by the way, lean into history, Black women's history. So I'm very much interested in how history shows up here and how Black women's history and Black girls' histories unfold on the pages. And a constant theme in your text for me was colorism. And so in a conversation that we had recently, I shared that I find colorism to be on the whole very understudied, and it's really Black women writers, poets, and literary scholars who are the ones who are always bringing this to the fore. It also appears in Dr. Griffin's latest book too, and it's something that should definitely be discussed and grappled with more, especially colorism as it applies to Black people and Black women. But I'd be interested in knowing, more about how colorism takes shape in your poems, why it appears, its importance. For example, the Fresh Princess sonnets was one area where it showed up with the discussion of the dark-skinned Aunt Viv, and ultimately honoring, celebrating, and elevating the Aunt Viv that's not talked about enough and has been villainized in many ways for so long, the real actress behind Aunt Viv. So I'm interested in hearing from you that piece of things.
Ooh,
yeah.
Okay, so colorism is here because for me it's real. Like I mean, it's a real period, but my lived experience in trying to, like I said, set myself upright was understanding that I wasn't ugly. I know that's people might think of it as like a surface word, but that ugliness isn't just like aesthetically, am I like a beautiful woman, right? It's like, no. And as it relates to my complexion, that's what makes me, this ugly, vilified person, individual version. And the Fresh Princess sonnets touched on it because it is such a part of, I think for me and for many, like girlhood. I know Dr. Griffin references it, right? Like the jokes made about Black girls that we even make with each other. And so I mentioned, I should have talked about Kelly Rowland, but I know I talked about the Spice Girls, where it was Scary Spice, right? And she's not even the darkest complexion, but she was the Black Spice Girl. So that's who you had to be. And she was deemed quote unquote scary. Like that was her moniker. And so if you're in a group of people, they look at you, people of other races, that was my experience, like, oh, well, you have to be Scary Spice, right? That's who you have to be. Similarly, when it came to within the Black community, my experiences with being like my people do it without trying to be, mean, but family members saying, well, you're the chocolate one. And to my sister who's lighter, you're the butterscotch. Like they would make up these names, right? And it's all done, I think, of course, not with the intention of hurting people or teaching negative understandings of who we are, but that's what happens. And so for me, with the dark skin Aunt Viv piece in particular, is like, no. Like what's not talked about enough for me is how like happy she was. And I think oftentimes the dark skinned friend, we can talk about, now we're talking about pop culture, but we're here. When you look at, there's the dark skinned sidekick, right? So like Pam and Gina with Martin, Dejanay with the Proud Family. I know I'm dating myself here, but whatever, we're here. I wasn't allowed to see House Party, but from what I understand, there's that. And then even Poetic Justice, right? There's Janet's character, and then there's her. So there's this history of the dark skinned friend being a hater or being a sidekick or, not really being a centralized character. And then Girlfriends kind of mixes that up. I could go on forever about this. I'm trying to bring it back. But dark skin Aunt Viv was called dark skin Aunt Viv because she was replaced with a lighter skinned woman, and that wasn't a part of the story. There was no explanation. It just happens, right? Because Janet Hubert was out. And like you said, vilified and villainized in that way. But she was really happy, like in terms of her portrayal on television and what I saw, what I was given. She was a central character. She was happy. She was deemed beautiful. She was deemed sexy, even when she, wore certain things, like the audience would whistle. And people didn't talk about her ever, like just never. She never got her due, in my opinion, growing up. It wasn't like, yeah, well, I'm going to be, Viv, or you'll grow up to be like this. And I would hear people playing like they were Claire Huxtable, or hear boys say like she was a baddie and all these other things. So for me, dark skin Aunt Viv acts in that piece, but also like in my life as this symbol of the reality of like happiness as a dark skinned woman, that it can happen, that it did happen, even if no one else notices it, even if no one else pays attention to it, right? You still can create a life for yourself where you understand your beauty, where you have children and you raise them, where you have a successful career. And so for me, bringing her to light was important in terms of like her being an important pop culture figure for me. But I don't think, Dr. Griffin's work, of course, but I haven't read a lot of work where colorism is really delved into and discussed heavily. I think usually it's kind of like the surface is scratched. Like we talk about it, acknowledge it, and then, put it back. So I think I know it was really important for me to discuss that because it is such a big part of even how I conceive of myself now and in this world. And I talk about texturism a tiny bit, like that I do touch and put back, but like even the texture of my hair combined with my complexion and what that meant in terms of how I saw myself. Yeah, I could go on and on. I feel like I'm rambling now, but that's what's happening in that piece. And I'll let Dr. Griffin take the end.
No, I'll say, it's Black women writers talk about it all the time. And I think that that's one of the things that as a person who came to Black women's literature and it gave me life, I was very grateful for the way it affirmed what I knew to be my experience as a girl. And in reading it in your work, what I initially felt, and this is a kind of intergenerational experience, what I initially felt is that I felt hurt because I felt, God, I wish that were over. I wish there were no beautiful, absolutely beautiful young Black women who experienced that and to see it and recognize it and know it's familiar, right? And to know the ways that it comes up, right? The vicious ways, the virulent ways, or the ways from people who love us who, like pretty to be so Black, and I think that was one of the things that I thought, wow, that's an intergenerational thread that Gwendolyn Brooks writes about, and I had hoped that the girls who were coming up after I was an adult weren't experiencing it in the same way, but it still feeds our literature, and it's still real. And our literature is a place where we can grapple with it and see that it's constructed and that it really has nothing to do with or say about who we really are. The people who are using it have no idea like how they are implicated in a kind of brutal history. And that your poems and that literature allows younger Black women to see themselves, really puts a mirror up to them and acknowledges the pain of that experience, but also that that's not your reality. It's not really defining who you are. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just want to add, I do think that there's also parts of it that in the next book you'll read, but read about it. But, there's also a reality that can become and did become confusing for me, which also is why dark skin on Viv is talked about, right? Because as Dr. Griffin referenced, talk about Gwendolyn Brooks with Maud Martha and texts like I'm the Idiot, and she does deal with it. And so because of what you're hearing, even I talk about it in some of the rap songs I mentioned, but hearing and ingesting that and believing that you're not attractive or all of this because of your complexion, and then growing up to understand that you're still in a strange form, and this does centralize patriarchy, and I'm sorry I'm doing that right now, but that you're still like desired by these same people who've been talking trash about you for so long because of your complexion. And that's a very real, I think, confusion for me and for many people, I think. And that also then, is something that hopefully the Viv poem touched on as well. Yeah.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Thank you. Did we have any thoughts or responses that came up for anyone in the audience at all? As Dr. Griffin shared, there's so many notes that I compiled and gathered. I mean, there's so much that can be said about this work. It tells so many stories, whether it be, this topic of colorism came up for me in reading your work, but also Phyllis Wheatley, you spoke a little bit about already how Phyllis Wheatley relates to your work and those of other Black writers. That's another parallel that I saw and was able to draw between your work and that of Dr. Griffin too. So I wonder if in our last minute or two that we can likely end on that note if there aren't comments from the room. Would love to hear your thoughts more on how Phyllis Wheatley informs this piece and your work.
Yeah. Are there any questions? I want to make sure.
Yes, absolutely.
No? Okay, I'm going to start talking, I guess. If you do have a question, in the chat, I don't know. Okay, it's not hard. It's just layered. Phyllis Wheatley is really important to me. I had the honor, I guess, to be able to, I've taught her in every poetry class I've taught, which is important to me. I've had my students read Samuel Okem's, her letter to Okem, as well as they've read June Jordan's Something Like a Sonnet for Phyllis Wheatley. So Wheatley is important to me for various reasons personally. I think when I first read her, the teacher who introduced her work to me was basically, of that mindset that she was a sellout when you read some of the work. And then, of course, being like, I don't know if that's right. Like, it seems like she's doing some interesting things here. Like maybe she's calling them out a bit. And then after reading June Jordan's essay, being connected to her as the person, I know, like her interiority, actually thinking about these, I think for me as a child, these figures were just figures. So there's these talking heads and these people in these books, and they're not people. And so having her humanized in that way also then closely connected me to my own faith struggles. I know, and clearly I am not in any way, shape, or form saying I know at all what chattel slavery looks like. So I just want to get that out there. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is, for me being in academia and also in as a Black woman poet, feeling at times like the tension between what is it to be a Christian and to affirm that part of myself and the part of my identity, with all of its violences and its history. And I was, like I said, a very angry little somebody. So I was like, yeah, I don't even know, like, whose God is this? And all of those questions that Phyllis Wheatley made room for. I mean, like I said, I have read a bit of Dr. Griffin, and so not just June Jordan, but Dr. Griffin also talks about, I think even in Read Until You Understand, right? The idea that we ignore the fact that Wheatley had a childhood before she comes to the US or is brought here, right? So what is it? I remember being 3. That's my earliest memory. And so what does it mean that she may have had, and more than likely did, have some type of understanding of a spirituality, and of a God, and a conception of that, related to her own culture prior to, having to assimilate because of chattel slavery. So for me, Wheatley, in a lot of ways, with the only manuscript we have, made it okay to be nerdy for me, but also she made it okay to use the words that because she literally wrote herself free, and I teach that in my class, right? But she teaches all that language can do, even though we understand it specifically in our context, but I think in all contexts, the ways that language can also be dangerous and is dangerous, right? The only way, and I say this to my class, I got this from a Dion Brand lecture, but the only reason we're all here right now is because there's language that exists that says we can do this. And if the language said otherwise, then we wouldn't be able to do this. So language actually does contribute to the way that we live. I mean, it governs our lives. So Wheatley, to me, says, okay, this is the language I've been given. This is the form I've been given. This is the tool I've been given. And I'm going to use this to set myself upright in this cricket room. And to be clear about the fact that, because I love and believe in this God doesn't mean that I love and believe in the version that you've given me. And so Wheatley, to me, being the foremother of Black poetry, but also having her first text be something, I'm not gonna lie, I did not like it when I first read it. I was like, I don't like all this formal verse. This is not for me. Why do we care about all these white people she's writing about? And then understanding exactly what she was doing, right? What the purpose of these pieces was, how a poet becomes an important poet. And it involves talking about what's happening and venerating those figures that, need to be venerated in order to be where you need to be. So the way she used language to free herself in a country that didn't love her. So I said a lot, but Wheatley, like I said, and I already touched on this before in terms of the formal choices and how I reason through that. But Wheatley's always kind of in the back of my head and very, very close to my heart in that way. Because I always wonder, she's a poet ancestor for me. So I'm always wondering about what her experience was like. I think I have a line in one of these poems that might be considered sacrilegious, but where I talk about imagining a twerking Phyllis Wheatley, she danced. Why can't we think about that? So I'm also kind of in love with and obsessed with an imagined interiority of her as a person, as a woman who had desires and thoughts and all that. But I'll stop talking now because I could talk about her and how much I love her forever. So.
Yeah, I would also say, I just think she was audacious. First of all, she was a child genius. She didn't know the language. She was 7 years old when she got here. And in 2 or 3 years, she's speaking and reading the Bible in Greek. I mean, and then she's audacious. She's writing the George Washington, little Black enslaved girl. She thinks she has something to offer. So I love her audacity. And I love the poet, novelist, Honoré Fanon Jeffers has a book that's many poems in Phyllis's voice that give her to us in a different way. So yeah, I feel the same way about her.
Great. Thank you again. For the room, I want to open the floor again, or possibility for sharing questions or thoughts, responses. And if not, I want to thank you all for being present, for listening into this book launch for Alexis V. Jackson's My Sister's Country. Again, such a powerful text. I'm so glad to have been able to read it, to access it, and to be in conversation with you both about this work. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Humanities Center for holding this as well, for sure. Your presence is appreciated. And again, thank you to our speakers, Alexis Jackson and Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin.
And thank you for moderating and pulling us together. So thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Great.
Get the book.
Yes, go get the book. Amazon, it's there. Support your local bookstores if you
Yes. Tell us how to find it. Yes, Amazon, local bookstores.
The publisher, Corey Press, you could go to also bookshops.org. There's a few Black women-owned bookshops you can.
And your website?
Oh, yes, my website. AlexisVJackson.com. You also can find all of the links there.
Okay, great. Yes, we definitely want folks to grab this book.
Thank you.
Thank you.